Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, heart racing as she saw the new message notification. She knew who it was from before even unlocking the screen. Tom, her husband Mark's best friend, the man she couldn't stop thinking about no matter how hard she tried. "Can we talk?" the message read. 3 simple words that sent her mind spinning with possibilities and her stomach churning with guilt. Sarah glanced at the clock. 2:37 p.m. Mark wouldn't be home from work for hours. She had time. Time she knew she shouldn't take, but found herself powerless to resist. "Okay, the usual spot in 20 minutes, she typed back, hitting send before she could change her mind. Sarah's hands shook as she grabbed her keys and purse, nearly dropping them in her haste. She paused at the hall mirror, smoothing her hair and checking her lipstick. "Why am I primping?" she chastised herself. "This isn't a date. We're just talking." But deep down, Sarah knew it was more than that. Every stolen moment with Tom felt charged with electricity, alive with possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. The drive to the small park on the edge of town passed in a blur. Sarah's mind raced, rehashing every interaction she'd had with Tom over the past few months. The lingering glances, the accidental touches, the inside jokes that left Mark looking confused and slightly hurt. When had it all started? Sarah couldn't pinpoint an exact moment. Tom had been a fixture in their lives for years, Mark's college roommate turned lifelong friend. He'd been the best man at their wedding 5 years ago, giving a speech that had the whole room in stitches. But something had shifted recently. Maybe it was the way Tom looked at her now, like he was really seeing her for the first time, or how attentive he was, always the first to notice when she got a haircut or wore a new dress. Whatever it was, Sarah found herself drawn to him in a way that both exhilarated and shamed her. She pulled into the small gravel parking lot, spotting Tom's blue Subaru already there. Her heart leapt into her throat as she saw him sitting on their usual bench, elbows on his knees as he stared at the ground. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself before getting out of the car. "You're just friends having a chat," she told herself. Nothing more. But as Tom looked up and their eyes met, Sarah knew she was only fooling herself. The spark between them was undeniable, a living thing that crackled in the air. "Hey," Tom said softly as she approached, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "Hi," Sarah replied, suddenly shy as she sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. "What did you want to talk about?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "I can't stop thinking about you, Sarah. I've tried, God knows I've tried, but I can't get you out of my head." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They'd danced around their feelings for months, but neither had ever stated them so plainly before. "Tom, she started, not sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to throw caution to the wind, to tell him she felt the same way. But the gold band on her left hand felt suddenly heavy, a reminder of the vows she'd made. "I know," Tom said quickly. "I know this is wrong. You're married to my best friend, for Christ's sake. I feel like the world's biggest asshole for even thinking about you this way, but I can't help it. There's just something about you, Sarah, something that draws me in no matter how hard I try to fight it." Sarah's heart raced as Tom's words washed over her. She should shut this down, she knew. Tell him they couldn't see each other anymore, that they needed to respect Mark and the sanctity of her marriage. But when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "I feel it too," she whispered, shocked at her own admission. "I've tried to ignore it, to convince myself it's nothing, but it's not nothing, is it?" Tom's eyes blazed as he looked at her, a mix of hope and hunger that made Sarah's breath catch. "No," he said softly. "It's definitely not nothing." Almost unconsciously, they began to lean towards each other. Sarah's eyes fluttered closed as she felt Tom's breath on her face. Just a few more inches and their lips would meet in the kiss she'd been dreaming about for months. At the last second, Sarah jerked back, reality crashing over her like a bucket of ice water. "We can't," she said, voice shaky. "Tom, we can't do this. It's not right." Tom nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I know. God, I know. Mark's my best friend. I'd never forgive myself if I hurt him like that." They sat in tense silence for several minutes, the air thick with unspoken desires and painful truths. Finally, Sarah spoke. Maybe we shouldn't see each other for a while. Outside of group settings, I mean. Give ourselves some space to get over these feelings. The words felt like sandpaper in her throat, but Sarah knew it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do if she wanted to save her marriage and Tom's friendship with Mark. Tom nodded slowly, his expression a mix of resignation and sorrow. "You're right, it's for the best." He stood up, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I should go. Take care of yourself, Sarah." Sarah watched him walk away, her heart breaking with every step. It was the right decision, she told herself. So why did it feel so wrong? The next few weeks were torture for Sarah. She threw herself into work and household chores, desperate for any distraction from thoughts of Tom. But he was everywhere, in the photos on the mantel from their college days, in Mark's stories about their latest golf outing, in her own traitorous dreams that left her aching and guilty. Mark noticed the change in her mood, commenting on how quiet and withdrawn she'd become. Sarah brushed off his concerns, blaming stress at work. She hated lying to him, but the truth would hurt him far more than these small deceptions. As the days turned to weeks, Sarah thought the intensity of her feelings for Tom would fade. Instead, they only seemed to grow stronger in his absence. She found herself analysing every interaction they'd ever had, wondering if there had been signs she'd missed early on. Had Tom always looked at her that way? Or was it a recent development? Had she always felt this pull towards him? Or was it just a result of the natural ebbs and flows of a long-term marriage? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Mark was home early. She quickly closed the photo album she'd been poring over, guiltily shoving it back on the shelf. "Hey, honey, I'm home," Mark called out, his cheerful voice at odds with Sarah's turbulent emotions. "In here," she replied, pasting on a smile as he entered the living room. Mark crossed to her, dropping a kiss on her forehead. "How was your day?" "Fine," Sarah said automatically. "Just catching up on some reading. How about you? You're home early." Mark grinned, practically bouncing with excitement. "I have news! Remember that big project I've been working on? Well, the client loved our proposal. They want to move forward right away." "That's great," Sarah said, genuinely happy for him. Mark had been stressed about this account for weeks. "It gets better," Mark continued. "They want me to fly out to their headquarters next week to hammer out the details in person. And get this, they said I could bring my wife along, make a little vacation out of it. What do you say? Want to spend a week in San Francisco?" Sarah's mind raced. A week away could be just what they needed to reconnect, to remind her why she'd fallen in love with Mark in the first place. Maybe it would help her forget about Tom and these impossible feelings. "That sounds wonderful," she said, meaning it. "When do we leave?" As Mark launched into the details of their upcoming trip, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This was her chance to recommit to her marriage, to push thoughts of Tom aside once and for all. A week later, Sarah stood in front of the bathroom mirror in their San Francisco hotel room, applying the finishing touches to her makeup. She and Mark were headed out to a fancy dinner to celebrate the successful completion of his meetings. The past few days had been a whirlwind of sightseeing and romantic moments. Sarah had to admit, being away from the pressures of everyday life had done wonders for their relationship. She and Mark were laughing and talking like they hadn't in months. But even as she enjoyed their time together, Sarah couldn't fully banish thoughts of Tom from her mind. She'd catch herself wondering what he would think of the Golden Gate Bridge, or how he'd react to the street performers in Fisherman's Wharf. Sarah shook her head, pushing those thoughts aside. She was here with her husband, and she was determined to focus on him. "You almost ready?" Mark called from the other room. "Our reservation is in 20 minutes. "Coming!" Sarah replied, giving herself one last look in the mirror before joining Mark. His eyes widened appreciatively as she entered the room. "Wow," he said softly. "You look incredible." Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her at his words. "This is where I belong," she told herself firmly, "with my husband who loves me." The restaurant was elegant and romantic, with candlelit tables and sweeping views of the bay. As they perused the menu, Sarah found herself relaxing, swept up in the ambience and Mark's attentive company. They were midway through their entrees when Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing slightly. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. "Yeah, it's Tom," Mark said. "He's asking if we want to grab drinks when we get back. Says he has some big news he wants to share." Sarah nearly choked on her wine. "Oh?" she managed, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Did he say what kind of news?" Mark shook his head. "No details. Knowing Tom, he probably just wants an excuse to go out. What do you think? Should I tell him we're free next Saturday?" Sarah's mind raced. The thought of seeing Tom again both thrilled and terrified her, but she knew avoiding him forever wasn't realistic. He was Mark's best friend after all. "Sure," she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Sounds fun." As Mark typed out a response, Sarah took a large gulp of wine, her appetite suddenly gone. So much for pushing thoughts of Tom aside. The rest of their trip passed in a blur of tourist activities and romantic dinners. Sarah tried her best to stay present, to soak in every moment with Mark, but as their return flight approached, she found her anxiety growing. What would it be like to see Tom again? Had time and distance changed anything, or would that spark still be there? And what was this big news he wanted to share? Before she knew it, they were back home, unpacking suitcases and settling back into their routine. Sarah both dreaded and longed for Saturday to arrive. When the day finally came, Sarah spent far too long agonizing over her outfit and makeup. She told herself she just wanted to look nice for a night out, but deep down she knew she was primping for Tom's benefit. They met at a trendy new bar downtown, the kind of place with craft cocktails and a line out the door. Tom was already there when they arrived, nursing a beer at a high-top table. Sarah's breath caught as their eyes met. All her hopes of the time apart dulling her feelings evaporated in an instant. If anything, the attraction felt even stronger than before. "Hey guys," Tom said, standing to greet them. He gave Mark a backslapping hug, then turned to Sarah. There was a moment of awkward hesitation before he leaned in, brushing his lips against her cheek in a chaste hello. Even that brief contact was enough to send Sarah's pulse racing. She quickly sat down, needing something to do with her hands. "So, what's this big news?" Mark asked as he signalled for a waitress. "Don't tell me you finally convinced someone to marry you?" Tom laughed, but there was an edge to it that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Not quite," he said. "But, I am seeing someone. It's still pretty new, but I think it could be serious." Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the gut. Tom was dating someone? When had that happened? And why did the thought fill her with such irrational jealousy? "That's great, man," Mark said enthusiastically. "Tell us about her. How'd you meet?" As Tom launched into the story of how he'd connected with Amanda through a dating app, Sarah found herself growing more and more agitated. She downed her cocktail quickly, barely tasting it as she signalled for another. "She sounds lovely," Sarah said when Tom finished, proud of how sincere she managed to sound. "We'd love to meet her sometime." Tom's eyes met hers, a flicker of something passing between them. Regret? Longing? Sarah couldn't be sure. "Yeah, definitely," Tom said. "Maybe we could do a double date sometime?" The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Sarah. She found herself drinking more than usual, desperate to numb the ache in her chest. By the time they said their goodbyes, she was more than a little tipsy. "You okay?" Mark asked as they walked to their car. "You seem a little off tonight." Sarah forced a smile. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired from the trip still, I think. And maybe those cocktails were stronger than I realised." Mark accepted her explanation easily, but Sarah could tell Tom wasn't convinced. He kept shooting her concerned glances as they said their goodbyes. That night, Sarah lay awake long after Mark had fallen asleep, her mind spinning. She should be happy for Tom, she knew. He deserved to find someone who could love him freely, without the complications and guilt that came with their situation. But all she felt was a gnawing emptiness, a sense of loss, for something that had never really been hers to begin with. The next few months were a study in contrasts for Sarah. On the surface, everything was fine. Great, even. Her job was going well. She and Mark seemed to have recaptured some of the spark from early in their marriage, and their friend group was as tight-knit as ever. But underneath it all, Sarah felt like she was slowly drowning. Every time they hung out with Tom and Amanda, she had to paste on a smile and pretend she was happy for them. had to watch as Tom gazed at Amanda with the same intensity he used to reserve for her. Had to listen to Mark and Amanda swap embarrassing stories about Tom, all while feeling like an outsider in her own life. The worst part was, Sarah genuinely liked Amanda. She was smart, funny, and clearly head over heels for Tom. In another life, they might have been great friends. But every time Amanda casually touched Tom's arm or leaned in to whisper something in his ear, Sarah felt a stab of jealousy so intense it took her breath away. She tried to bury her feelings, to focus on her marriage and her own life. But thoughts of Tom were like a splinter she couldn't quite dig out. Always there, always painful, impossible to ignore. Things came to a head at Mark's birthday party. They'd invited a small group of friends over for dinner and drinks, including Tom and Amanda. Sarah had maybe hit the wine a little too hard, her defences lowered by alcohol and the stress of playing hostess. She was in the kitchen grabbing more ice when she felt a presence behind her. She knew without turning that it was Tom. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low. Sarah shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel the heat of his body, so close but not quite touching. "Sarah," Tom said softly, "look at me, please." Slowly she turned to face him. The look in his eyes nearly undid her. A potent mix of longing, regret, and something darker she couldn't quite name. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Really and truly happy? Sarah opened her mouth to say yes, to assure him that everything was fine, but the lie stuck in her throat. Before she could formulate a response, they heard footsteps approaching. Tom quickly stepped back, grabbing a bowl of chips just as Mark entered the kitchen. "There you two are," he said cheerfully, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Amanda was wondering where you disappeared to, Tom. Come on, we're about to do cake." As they rejoined the party, Sarah felt like she was moving through a fog. Tom's question echoed in her mind, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Was she happy? Really and truly happy? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of being the perfect hostess, laughing at jokes she barely heard and refilling drinks with mechanical precision. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment in the kitchen over and over again. As the last guest trickled out, Sarah found herself avoiding Tom's gaze. She couldn't bear to see the questions in his eyes, knowing she had no answers to give him, or herself. That night, lying awake next to a softly snoring Mark, Sarah finally allowed herself to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for months. No, she wasn't happy, not really. She loved Mark, cared for him deeply, but there was a part of her that felt unfulfilled, restless. A part that came alive only when Tom was near. The realization brought no relief, only a deep, aching sadness. What kind of person was she, to be so dissatisfied with a good man who loved her, to yearn for something, someone she could never have? In the days that followed, Sarah felt like she was walking a tightrope, constantly on the verge of losing her balance. She threw herself into work and household tasks with a frenetic energy, as if staying busy could somehow drown out the turmoil in her heart. Mark noticed the change in her, commenting on how distracted she seemed. "Is everything okay at work?" he asked one evening, concern etched on his face. "You've seemed really stressed lately." Sarah forced a smile, hating herself for the lie. "Just a big project coming up," she said. "Nothing to worry about." But as the weeks wore on, it became harder and harder to maintain the facade. Sarah found herself snapping at Mark over minor irritations, then drowning in guilt at the hurt look on his face. She begged off group outings, unable to bear the thought of seeing Tom and Amanda together. It all came to a head on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had left work early, a pounding headache making it impossible to focus. She was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea when she heard a knock at the door. Assuming it was a package delivery, she didn't bother to check the peephole before swinging the door open. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw Tom standing there, soaked to the skin and looking as miserable as she felt. "Tom," she gasped, "what are you doing here?" He ran a hand through his wet hair, looking lost. I don't know, I just needed to see you. Can I come in?" Every instinct screamed at Sarah to say no, to close the door and pretend this never happened. But instead, she found herself stepping back, wordlessly inviting him inside. Tom stood awkwardly in the entryway, water dripping onto the hardwood floor. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have come. I can't stop thinking about what happened at the party, about what I asked you." Sarah's heart raced. "Tom, we can't do this," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He took a step closer, his eyes intense. "I broke up with Amanda," he said quietly. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What? Why?" Tom's laugh was hollow. "Because it wasn't fair to her, to be with someone when my heart belongs to someone else." The air between them crackled with tension. Sarah knew she should step back, should tell Tom to leave, but she found herself rooted to the spot, drawn in by the naked emotion in his eyes. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know this is wrong. I know we shouldn't feel this way, but I can't keep pretending. I'm in love with you. I think I have been for a long time." The words she'd both longed for and dreaded hung in the air between them. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Tom, Before she could finish the thought, Tom closed the distance between them. His lips met hers in a kiss that was both achingly tender and desperately passionate. For a moment, Sarah lost herself in the sensation, all the pent-up longing of the past months pouring out. But as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. Sarah jerked away, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God," she whispered. "What have we done?" Tom looked stricken, the euphoria of the kiss giving way to crushing guilt. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have. This was a mistake. I'll go." As he turned to leave, Sarah found herself reaching out, catching his arm. "Wait," she said. "We need to talk about this. Really talk." Tom nodded slowly. "You're right. We can't keep going on like this." They moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The physical distance between them felt both necessary and unbearable. "I love Mark," Sarah said after a long moment of silence. "He's a good man and he doesn't deserve this." Tom nodded, his expression pained. "I know, as my best friend. The thought of hurting him, it kills me." "But," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I can't deny my feelings for you either, and I don't know what to do." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities and painful truths. Finally, Tom spoke. "We have two choices," he said. "We can walk away right now, forget this ever happened. Go back to our lives and try to move on." Sarah's heart clenched at the thought. "And the other option?" Tom met her gaze, his eyes blazing with intensity. "We stop fighting this. We tell Mark the truth and face the consequences, whatever they may be." The weight of the decision pressed down on Sarah. Either way, people would get hurt. Either way, nothing would ever be the same. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to figure out what I really want." Tom nodded, standing up. "I understand. Take all the time you need. But Sarah," he paused at the door, looking back at her, "whatever you decide, know that my feelings won't change. I'll love you, always." As the door closed behind him, Sarah sank to the floor, sobs racking her body. She cried for the pain she was causing Mark, for the impossible situation she found herself in, for the future that suddenly seemed so uncertain. When Mark came home that evening, he found Sarah still on the floor, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Sarah," he said, alarmed, "what's wrong? What happened?" She looked up at him, her heart breaking at the concern in his eyes. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. The truth would hurt him, would likely destroy their marriage and change all their lives forever. But continuing to live a lie would be far crueler in the long run. "Mark," she said, her voice shaky but determined, "we need to talk." As Sarah began to speak, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The road ahead would be difficult, painful even, but for the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe again. Whatever happened next, at least she was finally being honest. With Mark, with Tom, and most importantly, with herself. The truth, as painful as it was the first step towards finding real happiness, whatever form that might take. As she looked into Mark's eyes, seeing the dawning realization and hurt, Sarah silently vowed to face the consequences of her actions with courage and integrity. It was the least she could do for the man she had loved, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. In that moment of brutal honesty, with her marriage crumbling around her and her life in upheaval, Sarah felt the first stirrings of hope. Not for a fairy tale ending or an easy resolution, but for the chance to live authentically, to explore the depths of her feelings for Tom without the shadow of deception. As she continued to talk, laying bare the complicated tangle of emotions and events that had led to this moment, Sarah knew that the hardest part of her journey was just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it head on, come what may.